Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Everson, David Everson. I'm going to walk you through an overview of the Old Testament, just some of the most basic nuts and bolts that I could imagine for being biblically literate when it comes to the Old Testament. The first slide that we'll look at here is I call Old Testament periods. And if you could break the Old Testament up into, I think it's 9 basic periods I have here. This is how I would imagine it. And so anytime you're reading in the Old Testament, you're looking at a passage, you're looking at a psalm, you're looking at a prophet, you should be able to plug each of these into one of these time periods. And this can be very useful. Hopefully none of this is unfamiliar to you, and this will be, you already know this, but in case you don't, maybe this is useful to you. The first category would be beginnings, and this would be the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Some people call it the prehistory. Usually folks use such a term when they view Genesis 1 through 11 as not being historical entirely. But of course, you should be familiar with such stories as Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah and the flood, and these sorts of things. Of course, this time period ends with Abraham. Abraham is mentioned in Genesis 11, and of course then he becomes the focus of much of the rest of the book of Genesis. So he's kind of the linchpin between those. Patriarchs and matriarchs would be the next section, and of course the book of Genesis has 50 chapters in it. The first 11 chapters are devoted to the beginnings, and the remaining chapters 12 through 50, focus on the lives of the patriarchs and matriarchs and the establishment of the covenant. And for those who often get very animated, focused on creation versus evolution, and debates surrounding that, though that's a very important question, and those are important debates to have. The focus on the book of Genesis really is on the patriarchs and the matriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph would be the 4 patriarchs to remember, and of course there's spouses that go along with each of them, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob with Rachel and Leah, and then Joseph. Okay, so that's patriarchs and matriarchs. After this time period, you have Moses and the Exodus. Of course, this time period is easy to place. Biblically, it's in the book of Exodus. Following that, we would have Joshua and the conquest. As you hopefully know, Joshua is described as a sort of right-hand man, assistant, servant of Moses, who sort of carries the mantle of leadership after Moses. So Joshua leads the conquest or the occupation of the land of Canaan for the Israelites. After Joshua, we have a period of the book of Judges. As the book of Judges says, it's a time period when everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And this is the time, importantly, when there was not a king. And so the book of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament are often focused upon political matters of kingship. Who is king? Who is going to be king? Who is the foreign king seeking to topple the Israelite king? And the book of Judges is the time period when there was no king. The United Monarchy. This is a time period where there's just 3 kings, right? So it's Saul, David, Solomon. Those are the 3 kings of the United Monarchy. When did Saul become king? That's a debated date. When David was king is less debated. Usually people place David right around the year 1000. David ruling from around 1000 to 960 for 40 years, and then Solomon 40 years after that. And then from around 920 on through to the destruction of each kingdom, you have the divided monarchy. Which comes next? So there's 3 kings of the united monarchy. The divided monarchy has many kings. It's easy to remember the united monarchy's kings. There's just 3. The divided monarchy, there's about 20 in each for the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom does not exist for as long as the southern kingdom did. The southern kingdom lasts much longer. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722. The southern kingdom was destroyed in 586. So that kingdom exists for more than 100 years longer than the northern kingdom. But they both had about 20 kings. Now, the rule of a king, if a king rules for a long time, that's generally considered a sign of stability. So David ruled for 40 years. He was able to maintain control and sort of peace in the land in a way. To have a kingdom go through 20 years between 920 and 720 is much quicker than going through 20 kings between 920 and 586. So some people see simply the number of kings in the north being a sign of instability. But we'll get to all of that later. So 20 kings in the north, 20 kings in the south. This is the period of the divided monarchy. Then we have destruction and exile. Of course, the north is destroyed, and the ruling class, as it were, is carried off into Assyrian exile, never to be seen again. When the southern kingdom is conquered by the Babylonians, they're carried off into exile, where they live together in exile as a community, and they're able to return. And so you have destruction and exile. The south was the only kingdom to return from that exile. So there you have it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 periods for the Old Testament. And that's where the Old Testament ends. The Old Testament ends, for Protestants anyway, the Old Testament ends in the Persian period when people are returning from exile to the Promised Land. So the Old Testament really ends on a very positive note. Hello again, this is Dr. Everson talking about some important dates for the Old Testament. In the previous video we had the 9 periods of the Old Testament that I like to sort of mentally break everything down into. Here are some key dates that would go along with those different time periods. These are just good sort of pieces of a scaffolding you can use to create your structure of Old Testament knowledge, if that metaphor works. Okay, important dates. 1446 or 1250. 1446 is the traditional date that's given for the Exodus, and this is based upon the description of the dedication of the temple built by Solomon. And they talk about the temple being built 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And so if you do the math on that, you end up with 1446. So middle of the 15th century. The date 1250, of course, comes from Wright, Albright, and Bright. Those 3 archaeologists back in the day came up with a 13th century argument for a historical Exodus. There's a number of folks today who would still want to argue for this. Of course, the third option would be that there was not an Exodus. As an evangelical, of course, I'm not comfortable with that idea, but you can find archaeologists and Old Testament scholars such as Finkelstein and others who would say that the Exodus has very little to do with history. But 1446 is the date I like to go with personally, believing in an historical or a historical Exodus. So that's the first one. 1025 would be the date I would assign to King Saul. And so that would be the beginning of the United Monarchy, 1025. So you've got from 1025 down until 920 for Solomon. You've got 100 years of the United Monarchy. So 922, that's the date for the beginning of the divided monarchy. As we said in the previous slide, we've got 3 kings for the united monarchy. Then we've got about 40 kings altogether for the divided monarchy. Okay, 722. This was the date for the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. Of course, when the kingdom was divided, we had the northern 10 tribes of Israel and the southern 2 tribes of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah. And 722 is the destruction by the hands of the Assyrians. And of course, with the fall of any kingdom, this is a process, and you can't give it, usually you can't give the fall of a kingdom a singular date, but if you had to pick a date, this would be 722, the fall of the north to the Assyrians. Of course, the Assyrians are the bad guys of the Old Testament. The descriptions of the Assyrians are quite horrible, and people hated them. This is why Jonah doesn't want to preach in Nineveh, because he wants them to be destroyed. And this is why Habakkuk talks about people clapping when they hear of Assyria's destruction, because they're delighted in their suffering, or what the Germans would call Schadenfreude, malicious joy. Okay, 722, the fall of the north to the Assyrians. 586 would be the very famous destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. This is more famous of the 2 destructions. Of course, here the temple was destroyed, and this was done at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, a very famous Babylonian king. We'll learn more about him later. So 586 is the destruction of the south. Moving on, 539, this would be the rise of the Persian Empire, or 539 would be the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And this is very important because it allows for the return of people from exile. So 539 also marks the return of, the beginning of the return of Judeans, people from the southern kingdom, exiled Israelites from the southern kingdom, from Babylonia back to the promised land. So this is the Persian period, 539. 515 marks the destruction, the construction of the temple, right? So people return from exile, and the temple is rebuilt in 515. Of course, this is a very big deal. If you'll notice, there's 70 years between 586 and 515, or approximately 70 years. And of course, within Judaism, this becomes a very important number. 332, this marks the rise of Alexander the Great. So the Assyrians conquered the Babylonians. The Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and the Greeks conquered the Persians, right? And the battles between the Persians and the Greeks is very famous. I mean, to be fair, Alexander the Great is really part Macedonian, or is considered Macedonian. And so he's not exactly a Greek, but, it's Greek culture. They spoke Greek. The Macedonians, of course, were just neighbors to the north of the Greeks, and we'll call them Greeks. So 332, Alexander the Great basically inherits the Persian Empire. So he had an empire that went from Macedonia and Greece in the west, and it stretched all the way to the Indus River, which is the border of India. So he had this massive kingdom. And as the Romans said, Alexander wept when he saw that there were no more kingdoms to conquer, which of course isn't true, but he did have a massive, massive empire. And that's 332. And of course, this is important in the intertestamental period, or as some people would call the Second Temple period between the Old and the New Testament, because you have the spread of Greek culture. Right, the New Testament was written in Greek, and we have Jewish literature being written in Greek in between the Old and the New Testament. Of course, the books of the Apocrypha are written or survive in Greek, such as Maccabees or Ecclesiasticus, Wisdom of Solomon, things like that. Okay, 332, Alexander the Great conquers the Persians. Okay, and then moving on, we've got 4 BC, which is marks the birth of Christ. Ironically, people date the birth of Christ 4 years before Christ, which of course doesn't exactly make sense. But to be fair, it's difficult to date hundreds of years into the past if you are a monk from the late antique period when our dating system was first set in place. So Jesus is born around the turn of the century. Of course, AD 30, we have the death and resurrection of Christ. AD 70. AD 70 was the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans, the so-called First Jewish Revolt. This was a big deal. Rome sent 1/4 of all of its legions to the southeast Mediterranean, to Jerusalem, to Palestine, as the Romans called it, to take care of this revolt. It was massive, and it lasted for years, several years. I mean, AD 70 is sort of the culmination of it with the destruction of the temple, but several years before this it was going on, and it was huge, a massive revolt. You could do a whole course on the Jewish revolt against the Romans. So that was AD 70.